Welcome to Risk Revolution, a podcast series that examines all aspects of risk management in the life sciences industry. We'll talk to industry experts on best practices for identifying risk, assessing risk, measuring solutions, implementing solutions, and monitoring results. Here are your hosts, Nuala Callan, Valerie Mulholland, and Laurie Richter.
Well, welcome back to Risk Revolution, our monthly series seeking to advance the maturity of risk management practices across the life science sector. As usual, we cover the topics that challenge professionals within our biopharmaceutical and medtech industries, and we aim to shake up the paradigm to revolutionize ways in which we perceive and proactively manage risk. And for episode 24, Laurie sat down with a risk expert and practitioner in the supplier risk management space, Rosanna Bules. But first, let's do a quick debrief with Laurie regarding a knowledge management article that you recently published in BPI with Nathan and Marty.
Yes, thanks, Nuala. So yes, we put together a two-part paper on improving the effectiveness of your QMS using knowledge management with a particular focus on early stage pharmaceutical companies. So in particular, it's been a few of our experiences that when we go to early stage companies, there's a lot of things circulating around, documents are saved in various places, and it's really important to get a handle on information in that early stage so that it doesn't get out of control as you move through phase 3 and onward to commercialization. So the emphasis was really placed there. I just want to let the listeners know too, these are very simple knowledge management exercises that can be performed that can help with that knowledge transfer and retention in your company at an early stage. So great article, two parts, because we put so much great stuff in there, a lot of key takeaways. And as everyone knows, Marty is our knowledge management expert out in the industry. Nathan came at it from a learning management system perspective and a document control and management perspective. So lots of great tips and tricks in that article, and that'll be linked in the show notes too.
Yeah, I loved the article. And as usual, it provides great insight. But as you say, there's lots of click boxes to get to some extra tools and question sets that you can use. So I found it really, really helpful. And in fact, I was at our TU Dublin PRST Quality Business Leadership Summit last Friday here in Dublin. And the amount of discussion throughout the day about the importance of embedding, KM, knowledge management practices, into the everyday business in order to really provide the best opportunity for that robust risk-informed decision-making or risk-based decision-making that you talk about often, Valerie. And it really about the importance of that too was raised by several of the leaders at the conference about how this is now becoming an imperative in order to make good business decisions, not about just making good risk-based decision making, but good business decisions. So let's move on to this month's guest, Laurie. Perhaps you'd like to introduce her.
Yes, thank you, Nuala. So I do want to make sure I get all of her credentials in there because Rosanna's done so many things. And Rosanna and I actually met many years ago when I delivered a QRM training program at her company. So we've been in connection and had discussed QRM activities over the years so that we can each grow and learn from each other. So Rosanna is a certified quality auditor with over 17 years in the biopharma industry. She started her career at Genentech. She was in QC initially, and later she built this passion for supplier quality management while she was at Gilead's Oceanside facility. There she found her passion. She's since brought that expertise to smaller biotech companies throughout her career now, building risk-based supplier oversight and audit programs. She's now launched her own consulting practice. Rosanna focuses on helping companies strengthen supplier partnerships, refine audit strategies, and drive sustainable compliance, always with a patient-first mindset. Let's take a listen to the interview. We have an exciting topic today. We're going to talk about supplier management and some of the risk-based approaches. And today I have Rosanna Bules joining me. Welcome to Risk Revolution.
Thanks so much, Laurie. I'm happy to be here to talk about this exciting topic.
Great. I'm excited too. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to start with the basics, and then we're going to build on this during this episode, just so people who are in various degrees of understanding of supplier management, they can kind of pick up and run with this too, wherever the topic is most important to them. So we'll start off at the very foundations of it. how would you define supplier management in the context of pharmaceutical and biotech companies? What's really in scope there?
So this process for supplier management, it's the end-to-end life cycle that sponsor companies can utilize to not only initially qualify and audit their suppliers, but I'd argue even more importantly, how they maintain ongoing oversight and continuous monitoring of those suppliers. When it comes to GMP, the suppliers that are in scope of this process are anything that impacts your GMP operations. So this would include your contract manufacturing and testing services, raw material suppliers, third-party logistics, companies performing storage and distribution functions, as well as other contracted service providers such as equipment calibration and pest control. Really anything that can either directly or indirectly impact your GMP operations. And in an ideal world, this program would be developed by a cross-functional team, not just quality. I know that's a big theme in Risk Revolution in the podcast. We don't want to
Yep.
do this in a silo.
No.
And it really should be thoroughly documented and endorsed by decision makers so that you really have high-level management on board with how this process works. It'll provide you a systematic and a risk-based process for qualifying, auditing, and monitoring the suppliers that support GMP operations.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think all of us that are probably listening to, we've all had our challenges with managing those suppliers. And I think that's where the risk piece becomes so critical, is that helps us with that management. So now I'll jump into so we'll take it a little deeper. What does good supplier oversight management look like? What does that look like to you?
Well, I think it's crucial. This is a crucial part of our business. We operate in a highly regulated environment where quality failures can lead to severe consequences both for our patients and for our product. And we should really regard our supplier network as an extension of our internal processes and having the appropriate controls and oversight over the materials and services that they provide to us. And in fact, our regulations and guidance documents make it very clear that sponsor companies are responsible and accountable for ensuring compliance with applicable regulations and standards across all GXP operations, even if that work is outsourced. So I think it's a really critical piece to our business. And in a time when a lot of things are being outsourced, it's really under scrutiny right now.
Yeah, I want to make sure everybody heard that, especially if you are a sponsor and you are small and you are outsourcing everything. It does not mean that you don't have the responsibility of that oversight. And I know we like to think that, hey, we outsource that; they're going to perform that, whatever that activity is, like you said, Rosanna. But it's also important that we understand that we are accountable for the outcome of that too, that we are still the sponsor. So thank you for
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's jump into now building that program a little bit. So we've kind of have this general context and foundation now. When an organization is setting up or refining its supplier oversight program, where should they begin? Are there foundational elements that you recommend kind of putting in place first to get that going?
Yes. So I think whether an organization is refining their program or they're starting from scratch, this should really be approached as a formal documented risk assessment. And as I mentioned before, this exercise should include the stakeholders involved in those or outsourced activities. So you should have, of course, QA, but you want the analytical QC folks, your manufacturing and supply chain, facilities and engineering, validation, anyone that's involved in the oversight of those outsourced activities to be a stakeholder in this assessment. And as with any risk assessment, our first step should be information and data gathering. So you'll want to prepare a list of your existing or your intended suppliers. As you're preparing this list, you might start bundling them into different types: contract manufacturing, contract testing, raw materials, third-party logistics, so on and so forth. And you'll want to make sure that you document the full scope of the services or materials that these suppliers provide, because it'll also feed into your approved supplier list, which is a key piece in oversight and auditing. You'll also want to gather supplier performance data. If you're already working with these suppliers, you can request and gather current information about their performance, their compliance with your contractual requirements, on-time delivery of services and materials, deviations and OOSs, complaints, any major changes they've notified you of. This step is much easier and consistently utilized, especially if you have an electronic QMS from which to pull your data. So I like to highlight any opportunity you have to utilize an electronic system makes this not only easier, but consistently when you're applying it across different suppliers. And the last piece when it comes to information gathering, any public information about these suppliers, their regulatory inspection history. There's a great website, it's called Retica. It used to be called FDA Zilla. You can gather a lot of information that's public about inspections that have happened at these suppliers. Any information about the company history and financials, indicators of stability, these should all feed into your assessment of these suppliers as we get into the risk piece. One thing I almost forgot, any audit history. If you've already audited these suppliers, you can use that data too from the audit performance and observations to feed into a compliance piece for the risk assessment. And as I mentioned, this is just the first step. So once you have all of this preliminary data, the next steps will involve the application of risk-based principles to really define your program and the oversight of your suppliers.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think right now with the current sort of tumultuous environment in pharmaceuticals, probably looking at that financials and the sustainability of that company right now might be really critical too, from a risk perspective, right? Maybe it's a
Yeah.
little bit risky right now. So you mentioned the risk management piece. Let's talk about that because that's of course the crux of risk revolution. How does QRM tie into supplier management? And can you walk us through what those risk principles are that should guide that supplier oversight too?
Yes, so if we apply the principles from ICH-Q9 to supplier oversight, our goal is really to develop a risk-based approach that will allocate to each supplier the appropriate amount of resources, time, and effort commensurate with the potential risks that supplier poses to our operations. And so this is essentially a prioritization effort, right?
Yeah, love ICHQ9. You referenced it almost exactly. That's great.
Yeah, yeah. And so the best way to achieve this that I've seen is to utilize a risk ranking and filtering approach. So this is a tool that can be used to prioritize risk based on the criteria that we'll define. This is not a one size fits all exercise. It really depends on the company, their operations, and their supply chain. But we see this tool commonly used for other quality systems like deviations, CAPAs, change control classification, and in this space for supplier oversight. So the output of these efforts will determine not only your supplier audit frequency, which is always a big thing, but any other oversight requirements you want to implement based on how you categorize your suppliers. So the first step I always take with risk ranking and filtering approach with a supplier is to determine the intrinsic risk. And what I mean by intrinsic risk is the impact to your process. We want to establish and define categories for our suppliers based on that impact to the product quality, business continuity, as well as the criticality and complexity of their materials and services in our process. So this intrinsic risk typically translates into the assignment of supplier tiers. Tier 1, 2, and 3 is how I commonly see this applied. And the tier represents, when you're thinking of quality risk management, this represents our severity component. And that's the severity of that supplier in our operations. And just like severity in any risk assessment, the severity doesn't change unless the scope and operations for that supplier change. That will remain the same. This tier level can help us to define contractual agreements required for different suppliers, your default audit frequency based on that tier, which we'll talk about audit frequency again in a second, and other requirements like data and documentation review. So that's the intrinsic risk. That's our severity component. And the second step for this is when you talk about supplier performance data is to determine the compliance risk. So to further prioritize our oversight efforts, we can use data, the data that we just compiled, as a filter to focus on our most critical suppliers. We'll define the criteria for compliance risk scoring, usually high, medium, and low, and the output can translate into a higher or lower audit frequency compared to the default frequency for that tier.
Okay. Wow.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, this is great information. Go on. This is great.
And so keep in mind that what I also want to make sure we don't forget is this is just the setup. I mentioned before that I'd argue that the ongoing monitoring and oversight is more important than the initial qualification. As you engage in normal operations, you're going to have more data coming in. There might be an OOS that occurs for the lot release of your product. You might have to issue a supplier corrective action request or SCAR for issues that you note with the supplier's materials and services. You might receive a critical change that they send to you about the transfer of operations to another facility. All of these data points can be factored into that compliance risk to provide you with a current and accurate measure of their risks, and that will guide you in the oversight. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but I do recommend that each supplier be assessed at least on an annual frequency, typically when you're creating your annual audit plan. And again, after any audit that occurs, you want to constantly be gathering data to keep a current pulse on how these suppliers are performing. And since this compliance risk will evolve over time with new data, your risk assessment will also evolve.
I think it's important to note too, when you're saying all of these things, that a lot of this is going to be a lot of work up front to establish that supplier. I think that's important. It's the maintenance piece that might actually get a little bit easier based on their risk scoring, right? So it might
Right.
seem a little overwhelming to people at first, but that's just to establish that framework. Once you get that, just like everything with risk management, once that upfront work is done, then it becomes like a lot easier to sustain it because you did that upfront risk ranking and you understood their history. Now, to your point, some things might change. The frequency might change. Maybe they become a bit more difficult to manage. But we'll talk about that a little bit later too. But I think it's that establishment initially that can seem a little bit like a lot, but it actually is going to help you out in the long run too.
Absolutely. I think it really is the upfront work that takes the longest time and collaboration. Once you have the framework and this risk assessment, it really is plug and play with
Yeah.
making sure that the services are still the same and factoring in what kind of compliance data that you have. And that really guides you in your process as long as you follow your process and maintain consistency with it.
Yeah, I think and I think where people struggle too is in absence of this, you don't really have a good rationale sometimes for why you're doing what you're doing, and you're probably going to come at it inconsistent. You mentioned that. This builds in the rationale, and it actually streamlines your process and it makes it consistent. So it's a win-win. It's just a lot of upfront, that you have to do. So how
Right.
might this look different for a raw material supplier versus a service provider or a lab or a CDMO? What might be the differences between those types of providers?
Your CDMOs and contract test labs will typically be your highest risk suppliers. And depending on how much you outsource, you might also have third-party logistics service providers that handle your product. You'll very likely audit those suppliers the most frequently and have more rigorous oversight measures in place for the delivery and receipt of your materials and services. You'll want to discuss what additional measures are needed for the oversight and review of their services. For manufacturing, you might consider a person and plant during operations, review and approval of batch records. What are your training requirements and data review requirements for a contract test lab? As your process matures, you'll want to consider which suppliers are key to your business. When you have this in place, you might consider having business review meetings between the management and your management to ensure your teams are in alignment with the fulfillment of contractual requirements, review of performance and issues, future forecasting. And I always advocate for a very collaborative approach with suppliers. I think
Yes.
business review meetings really help to foster that collaboration.
Yes.
We're not regulators, we're in a partnership here. So I think we should regard these relationships as such. You mentioned raw material suppliers. For raw material suppliers, you might have extra steps involved related to material testing and qualification in your process that occur in tandem with supplier qualification. And once a raw material supplier is qualified, you'll want to consider requirements and frequency for testing material batches upon receipt. You'll want to consider which suppliers require supply agreements to ensure you have stable and reliable sourcing of your production needs. It's really on a case-by-case basis, and the process will mature as your program matures.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I think I love the difference between all of those. And then you're going to have vendors that store your offsite documents, right? That
Right,
might be a little bit easier to manage, right? But again, all
right.
risk-based, based on that service that they provide. I love that.
Right.
Um,
Some of those suppliers can be managed just by the contract, like document storage, pest control,
yeah.
um, depending on the type of equipment that you have, equipment and calibration maintenance. Those they'll have a varying degree of oversight, and it'll be on a case-by-case basis based on what they provide to you.
Yeah, but again, you have that framework, right? You have that built into that rationale of why you're doing what you're doing. And I think that's important too. Many, many times I feel like risk helps so much with our rationale. And that's oftentimes what we sort of get ourselves in trouble with in this industry is we make decisions and we don't always have that good sound rationale documented. We had one, it was a good rationale. We just didn't write it down. So if you build these kind of programs, it's inherent and built into it.
Right.
So what does good ongoing oversight look like after a supplier is onboarded?
Yeah, there's many efforts that go into ongoing oversight and monitoring. I briefly mentioned this before, but suppliers should really be assessed on an annual basis, and that usually occurs when you're determining your annual audit plan. And this can be bundled into an overarching supplier performance monitoring process where you gather data and reassess the supplier's performance to ensure your risk ranking is current and accurate. This will obviously happen after any audits. You'll have regular requalification audits based on the output of that risk assessment. Hopefully it isn't with any regularity, but you might have the occasion for for-cause audits if the supplier is having recurring issues or not meeting contractual obligations. And all of this performance data and audit outcomes should be shared during quality management review meetings. Any performance issues or opportunities for improvement that are noted during those meetings can trigger an off-cycle supplier risk assessment to incorporate that new information into the assessment. The key here is that this is an evolving process. You're constantly
Yep.
gathering data. Once you do that risk assessment, you're not done. It's a constant process to gather data and ensure that you're keeping a good pulse on how this supplier is performing.
Yeah. And this can even go down to deciding your type of vendor, type of audit you're going to do for that supplier, correct? I mean, it
Right.
could be paper, it could be a questionnaire, it could be an on-site visit, like you said. That can also be part of that risk-based decision making then.
Absolutely. And I mean, you can even take it, but you can implement supplier scorecards that are posted on your supplier SharePoint site for added visibility to your stakeholders. And I also mentioned before too that some suppliers will warrant the need for business review meetings, and that
Yep.
really is an essential piece to foster that collaboration and partnership with your suppliers.
Yeah. And I loved how you talked about the transparency. I think one of the things I notice with some companies I've worked with, they have a risk log even with that particular supplier, but they tend to want to hesitate maybe about sharing that. And I feel like that's really a joint opportunity because vice versa, the supplier might have some things to say about that risk log. But you are also holding them accountable as that sponsor that, hey, these are the things I'm really concerned about. Let's talk about those. And I think it helps guide those business meetings, right? Or joint steering
Yeah.
committees, whatever you want to call them. So I think that's
Yeah.
great. All right. So, what are some of the biggest risks or concerns you have when it comes to supplier management oversight?
One of the biggest things I've seen more recently, and it's in terms of supply chain, is when we have sole sourcing of materials or services. I cannot even begin to count the number of times that I've had instances with issues with either the lack of availability of a raw material from our single sourced supplier, or even it happens, you have production failures and you have to have a new batch that you weren't planning for, and you can't get in the schedule with your sole CDMO. Um, these are really big issues when it comes to providing, quality product to your patients.
Yeah.
So as much as possible, we really need to have adequate backup suppliers in our network to account for any number of issues, sourcing, delays, pandemics, anything that can happen that
Yes.
can interrupt the supply chain and stop you from providing your patient to product to patients.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. How about recently? There was a hurricane, I believe, that took out a provider of IV solutions. And then there was a huge shortage across the entire United States in the hospitals, and hospitals were trying to hold back and not use as much IV solutions because one facility was responsible for making many of those that were used for clinical trials or just day-to-day surgical operations. So, 100%, it's one of those things that when people say what keeps you up at night, okay, obviously other personal things keep me up at night. But I'm not all about work.
Yeah.
but but one of the things, if I were to think about the industry, it's the sole suppliers piece. It just really worries me, especially when our supply chain runs so tight sometimes to be able to keep things going. So Yeah.
Right. And you might not even have a sole sourcing, but you might put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak.
Yes.
You might have sent an entire batch to one third-party logistics storage facility, and that's the site that, or that's the area that got hit by this hurricane. You want to
Yeah.
think about redundancy and risk when you're thinking about how you're storing your product, where you're storing your product.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important, especially with so much of the weather changing and becoming a little bit more severe in some parts of the country. We do have to think about those kind of things. And just in general, I thought the location of that site, it was interesting that there was only one that did that because they were basically located in a tornado area. So that already was a risk prior to that
Yeah.
ever happening. So that was
And
pretty
those things,
tragic.
right. And those things are part of um, that first step I talked about in the risk assessment, the intrinsic risk, geographic location and sole sourcing, those should all be things that are factoring into that intrinsic risk because that really does drill down to the severity of this supplier in your operations.
Yeah, 100%. Yes. Thank you. If someone's just getting started, they're either just building their program or trying to make improvements to their existing supplier management approach, what's the most important mindset shift they need to make that happen?
So developing your risk-based approach is really only half the battle. And that's really, to me, it's the easiest part of the process. I think when you have this risk-based approach, the hardest part is utilizing it. You mentioned if, you might have a system that's dated or it's not really structured, and you fall into the pitfall that we all do within quality of this is the way we've always done it. If you don't follow this approach, that's the hardest part. So I think this is where organizations really fall short. You have a great program, but maybe you don't follow it. And I want to harken back to the two primary principles of QRM. It's that the evaluation of risk to quality should be based on scientific knowledge and ultimately linked to the protection of the patient. And the level of effort, formality, and documentation of the risk process should be commensurate with the level of risk. If you
Yes.
have that in place, just follow your process. Trust your process to guide you in your decision making. The supplier program is evolving. There's always room to grow, new data to incorporate, new risk elements to consider, and existing risks that will change as time goes on. I think if you follow your process and you document it, you're going to be on the right path.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think I'm going to send a little shout out to my smaller companies. Sometimes when you're smaller, you may only have a handful of suppliers, and so you're sort of doing everything, right? Because you only have so many, and you don't maybe need that risk-based approach quite yet to manage the workload. Just keep that in mind that you eventually want to make that shift because it's not scalable or sustainable to be able to do all the things that you've maybe been doing to manage some of those suppliers because it's going to get bigger a lot faster once you go commercial, and you're not going to have that capability. So start to think about that, even though sometimes maybe when we start out with 5 or 6, we don't have that put in place yet. So I think that's a big mindset shift that has to happen when you're a smaller sort of phase 1, 2, moving towards commercialization at some point too.
Definitely. You want to think about what are those key performance indicators that you want to really focus on to get a good pulse on how those suppliers are performing, and that'll evolve.
Yeah, absolutely. Because sometimes at first you're just looking at 3 things, right? And then
Yeah.
eventually it gets a lot bigger and a lot harder to manage. So if our listeners take away just one thing from today's conversation, what should it be?
The supplier oversight process should be based upon and deeply embedded in risk-based principles. That's the key takeaway. And it's not a one-size-fits-all exercise. When you do that upfront work, which we talked about, that's the hardest part. You're going to build your program, but it's going to fit your needs. It's going to enable your organization to allocate the appropriate amount of time, effort, and documentation needed to oversee your suppliers. And as with any supplier program, the risks evolve and they should be continually assessed. So that periodic supplier performance monitoring is going to be a key part of the program. And when a new risk presents itself or a supplier isn't performing the way that your contracts require, you'll have that solid framework to follow for assessing and addressing those risks.
I'm going to close out. I want to ask Rosanna if she has anything more to say, but I'm also going to add to that. I'm going to say quality agreements, quality agreements, quality agreements. So
Yeah.
3 times and make sure that there's what's in there is what you want to be in there. because I think sometimes we're hesitant to push on that quality agreement, and sometimes we don't put everything in there that we want to see in there too. I don't know. Do you have anything to add about those quality agreements as well, Rosanna?
Yeah, as I've been mentioning contracts throughout, that's really what I'm referring
Okay,
to, your
excellent.
quality agreements. And the quality agreements will vary depending on the risk that that supplier has in your process. You might have a full-blown QTA, quality technical agreement, for your
Yep.
CDMOs and your contract test labs, your third-party logistics providers, and it might be streamlined for other providers that are providing a different risk level of services. Your equipment and calibration service providers, maybe your pest control is managed just by your statement of work or your MSA with them. But you really want to make sure that the key things that you're discovering are important, your KPIs, are somehow factored into that agreement so that they're held accountable to those expectations.
Thank you so much. Anything else that you want to leave the listeners with? This has been really exciting and engaging.
No, I think I've just been really excited to talk about this with you. I know way back when we first met and you were consulting and you
Yeah.
were really my trainer on QRM. It's really excited to come full circle and be able to share the information and knowledge I've gathered in these last few years. So thank
Right,
you for
here we
inviting
are.
me on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, thank you. And I can hear the passion in your voice when you talk about it. I can see how much you enjoy this, the level of detail that you go. I love it. You've got so much knowledge. I hope the listeners appreciate that. And as always, if there's any questions, we also love to have our listeners post those and we would get back to you, Rosanna, with any thoughts there. Otherwise, goodbye from Lori. Anything else from you, Rosanna? I think we're good to go.
No, thank you so much, Lori.
Thank you. A lot to think about there. Let's start with Val. What are your thoughts?
Lovely interview, Laurie, lovely guest. And I think I'd like to start by complimenting her. Her structured thinking, it made her recommendations exceptionally clear. I'd love to be like that. Anyway, thoughts. Well, the discussion, I think, provided a real practical example of ICHQ9 in action, understanding your reliance on each supplier, tiering them according to risk, and letting that risk assessment guide both the evaluation and the ongoing oversight. Yeah, I thought it was really clear. I also appreciated the emphasis on updating the risk management plan as new information becomes available. I mean, that was part of what you were saying in the recent article, Laurie. And Rosanna's emphasis on that ongoing monitoring. And it'd be more critical than the initial qualification. That was good advice too. I think too often once onboarded, sometimes supplier programs are treated as very static entities, and the idea that risk assessments should evolve as new data, like audit outcomes, deviations, scars, or change notifications arise. I mean, that's essential, and it's often maybe overlooked. Yeah. What else? Well, I really agreed that critical suppliers are business partners and their relationship should be managed accordingly. As someone who conducts many, many supplier audits, as you both know, I often observe that risk communication and knowledge management, knowledge sharing, it can be quite guarded. And I think we need to move towards that more collaborative mindset where risk is openly discussed, it's shared, the communication channels are transparent, and both parties have that shared understanding of risks and impacts. So, I often reflect, like, I think quality agreements might benefit from, being elevated with a risk-based lens, defining that ownership of risk and maybe strengthening those communication strategies. I think many monitoring strategies rely heavily on KPIs, number of scars, deliveries, complaints, and they're important, but those metrics sometimes feel a bit punitive. Does that make sense? They're often insufficient for building, a comprehensive shared understanding of risk. And especially when that knowledge management, knowledge generation part of it is outsourced. So I thought Rosanna's explanation of separating intrinsic risk, which I think she referred to as, the impact and the criticality, from compliance risk with the actual performance data, I thought that was a very helpful framework. And, for myself, I've seen several cases where performance issues go completely unnoticed because the initial risk categories aren't revisited regularly, or the compliance data just isn't integrated effectively into the oversight. So it might be valuable to develop additional metrics that track risk performance, track and measure the effectiveness of risk-sharing mechanisms, and ultimately identify areas for improvement. I think that would deepen the risk-based approach. So I suppose what I'm saying is that idea of elevating suppliers based on the maturity of the relationship, that resonated strongly with me. And I'd add that metrics reflecting responsiveness, transparency, commitment to continuous improvement, they could become very meaningful indicators of relationship health beyond, those operational KPIs. I mean, ultimately, I think I'd like to see suppliers rated not only on what they provide, but on the maturity of the relationship. Somewhat like that FDA's Quality Management Maturity Program, recognizing suppliers that support regular feedback, knowledge sharing, continuous improvement in risk practices. I think that would be a very impactful step forward. And as you both discussed, sometimes the supplier holds more power in that relationship. And smaller or newer product owners may not have enough commercial leverage to implement the risk strategies appropriate for that stage in the product lifecycle. That's a real challenge. Or I think you mentioned it as well, that looking for a backup supplier. Like backup suppliers offer redundancy, but your influence is sometimes limited because you're only an occasional customer. And I've picked that up during audits. I sometimes hear, or the comment might be made early in the audit interaction, you don't buy from us. And I think the unspoken implication there is, don't expect full enthusiasm, full engagement for addressing CAPAs or making improvements. So there are challenges there as well. What were your thoughts, Laura or Nuala?
Yeah, like yourself, I loved this interview. I felt it was like a masterclass in supplier management and oversight. So well done, Laurie, for finding such a knowledgeable and passionate guest this month on what is, really a mission critical subject these days. And like Val says, unfortunately, all too often it does not get the attention it needs until, the horse is bolted and something has gone wrong. The ultimate lagging metric. That's often when we engage most vigorously with our critical third-party suppliers. And so that's unfortunate. But I absolutely loved Rosanna's structured approach in building out her framework. And I agree that this is not only a very proactive, but also a really practical approach. And I think Rosanna herself pointed out that this can be helpful if you're building your new program, but also if you're refining or re-engineering your existing supplier oversight program, which many of them, and I know Val has inferred this as well, many of them are creaking at the seams because all too often we find that the number of external and critical third-party suppliers have grown exponentially. And this can happen, for many reasons, like portfolio expansion or M&A activity, or even, the basic strategic decision that is all too common nowadays to outsource activities. And what I find anyway is that the existing QMS, processes, policies, and procedures are often not fit for intended use at this stage. And moreover, there may be a range of high risk, low performance suppliers that are consuming many of the scarce resources in the supplier oversight, deviation management, SCARs and CAPAs. Just to keep the current materials flowing, to keep batches, under review and released. And those internal resources are often overwhelmed, and certainly with their daily workload and trying to connect and communicate with these third parties. Never mind getting on to commencing a redesign of their program or a continuous improvement program. So I thought Rosanna made it very clear. her framework was exceptionally well described, and it doesn't make it so daunting, I think, for people to consider, look, we really need to do something in this space. I particularly liked the build out of her preliminary supplier database set, and all the different criteria that she said would be important to go into that. And I know, Laura, you said during the interview, like, God, this sounds like a lot of work, but I think it pays dividends. And in fact, it actually mirrors the data set that we used for the risk serve research that I was involved with my colleagues in St. Gallen University in Switzerland for the FDA in recent years, looking at where they needed to put their boots on the ground in terms of risk surveillance. So not just looking at that compliance history, which all too often is that kind of minimum viable data set that people look at, but also looking at the financial health of the organization and the organizational stability. Things like, have they had churn in their C-suite? How frequently have they had their chief quality officer rotated through? And real-time performance metrics such as, on time in full and their supplier customer complaint rate, etc. So, this step is effectively a knowledge management activity to build out that detailed supplier profile and score it. But the power of doing that is invaluable, I think, and sets you up then, as Rosanna said, to keep the ongoing maintenance of the real-time data going. And like Val said there, I loved the mapping of that intrinsic or internal impact and criticality score, which she tiered as a tiered severity score. And like when we look at, risk priority numbers, severity is very much dictated by the, link to the patient. And very often doesn't move. And in this case, Rosanna pointed out that it doesn't change frequently unless your engagement with that supplier or what they're supplying you changes. And then, separating it from that compliance and performance score, which I suppose mirrors the probability of occurrence of harms and risks, which, she says is really important. She really emphasized the importance of updating that over time to give real actionable power to this approach. And that's one of the things that I often find is missing in a supplier oversight program, that there's an awful lot of emphasis on back and forth communications and trying to, wedge information out of the relationship, and very often the actionable insights are not being acted upon. So I think this framework that Rosanna has presented also really facilitates an ease of risk review, the tail end of our risk management process that's also often ignored or underwhelming in terms of driving actions. But I can see how it must be much easier with this kind of scoring and real-time data going in on the performance to be able to say, does somebody need to move up a tier, move down a tier? Does our approach need to change? And I really applauded Rosanna saying that it's not based on the tier. It's not a one size fits all. The frequency of engagement and how you engage and the level of oversight or support that you might be providing to a supplier is completely different. But of course, that real-time data has to drive the actions for those risk-informed decisions. And sometimes it is about putting it up to the business to move to eliminate poor suppliers that are causing, unnecessary threats to the business and also to the patient. And as she pointed out, really important, the thing that keeps her awake is these single sole source suppliers. Building adequate redundancy into our supply chain based on, very, very measurable outcomes from a program like this. And I suppose if the pandemic did anything for this aspect of the business, it definitely unmasked the lack of any effective management of risk in terms of our very stressed and fragmented supply chains that we deal with. And we've been tolerating that level of risk for far too long, simply because it's been outside the fence in the external supply chain, where we knew we had weaknesses. And of course, we come along with a global crisis and and everything breaks down. So I hope, you know, that stressed and fragmented supply chains have been highlighted in the industry ad infinitum, and certainly since the Pew report in 2011 into the heparin crisis, and many more failures since. So I really hope that if nothing else we take from the pandemic in terms of our supply chain resilience, that we really learn how to be much more proactive about our oversight. But I just loved it there. Absolutely loved it. Val, did you have anything else to add before we go back
Yeah,
to Laurie?
just as you were talking there, one more thought struck me, and I hate to add to the sleepless nights that clearly seem to go with supplier risk management, but here you go. Um, it struck me supplier selection often begins very early in the product development life cycle, and may be driven at that time by considerations that don't directly align with the commercial phase needs. For example, decisions at a clinical stage, they might prioritize factors like trial site locations, first filing strategies, and, priority may be given to whether or not a supplier or a CDMO can support development activities specific to the markets that are being targeted initially. And these priorities often shape the request for proposals at that stage. And that can become very evident when the product developer is not the same entity that goes on to commercialize the product. In cases where a developer is later acquired by a commercial manufacturer, these inherited supplier relationships, which we can become very locked into, they can be misaligned then with the new operational and regulatory realities, and that can pose challenges down the line. There's kind of legacy risks there that can be underestimated and sometimes unaddressed in M&As, as you say. What makes sense for early development, they mightn't scale operationally or meet the compliance expectations of the commercial phase. And that what struck me then is maybe, it highlights the need for formal requalification, risk reassessment during those transitions to commercialization, not only to assure the technical compliance is okay, but to verify those strategic alignment with the longer term supply chain and quality goals, because those relationships can be complicated by contractual obligations, the cost of change, the risk of change. And so it's important to maybe establish those, exactly what Rosanna was talking about, those risk-based frameworks, establishing them early, establishing the supplier performance metrics early to avoid being constrained later in your decision making under different conditions. So ultimately, as Rosanna so well articulated, QRM provides that structured way to surface and to address those challenges, review them iteratively across the life cycle. It builds the case for renegotiation, requalification, or even strategic transitions with suppliers, not based on fault, but on evolving risk and business needs. So, just taking that longer horizon view, I just thought she provided such a strong framework for thinking about all of that. And your discussion with her was so practical in that space.
Yeah, Laurie. I agree, Val. And we hear about this building meaningful partnership relationships with our critical suppliers all the time. Yet the contractual or the contract or the QTA all too often set out KPIs in regard to the commercial supply volumes, as you said. And we definitely need more KBIs, key behavioral indicators, into these contracts to set the expectations and measure what matters in terms of quality maturity, open levels of engagement, two-way conversation, problem-solving capability, and organizational culture. And I do want to point listeners on that point to something, for those of you who've already got your hands on the ISPE Advancing Pharmaceutical Quality APQ Guide for Cultural Excellence Assessment. It includes a lovely little assessment between contract givers and contract receivers in terms of desired behaviors and actions and outcomes. And it offers some really interesting KPIs to consider. And more importantly, it emphasizes not just the importance of building the partnership, but it talks about co-creating that partnership strategy between both parties. And I find that that's often, there's this hierarchy of power there that isn't often acknowledged. The contract giver seems to, be the person with the power and the purse strings. But often the contract receiver is the one with all the process understanding and process knowledge. And that's not often recognized. And in terms of patient focused excellence, do we even do enough to explain how critical their material or service is to our patients and this particular product that we're working with, or range of products? And do we recognize them when they do things that work well? And do we take the time to listen and understand maybe to the challenges they have in their, production schedules, where they're often a multi-product site, in terms of being able to process our orders if we have one of those situations that was discussed of, oh, a batch doesn't get approved, and then we're expediting the need for additional materials for a new batch. I think not. But I better stop before I get too excited on the whole subject of building a culture of excellence between our internal and external partners. Laurie, do you have any closing thoughts on Rosanna's masterclass in supplier management before we close out?
No, thank you. So first of all, I agree with everything that you guys both brought up, great points. And I want to thank Rosanna for a great interview. I think she was very pragmatic about her approach. I think it was good key takeaways for the listeners. I just wanted to add to some of the things that you both had said, which is really the quality agreement piece, I think is so we tend to use boilerplate language in these quality agreements. Sometimes we even use the one the vendor supplies. And we sort of tend to kind of go through the motions of it. I think there's a lot that can be gained and maybe adding some of the things that we learned during our risk management process with our supplier that may be red flags right out of the gate, maybe during site selection and questionnaire completion and discussions prior to even starting GMP operations. You already noticed some things that you want to put in there. That's that risk-based thinking and using that quality agreement to its fullest extent, which I know can be challenging. I also wanted to add that a little shout out to my early stage companies, because that's where I've been spending most of my last 5 years in my career. And I noticed some things that are different sometimes than when you're a full-fledged commercial in-house, production facility and you outsource some of your CMO work. This is one of those places where in the QMS, when you're building your QMS from the very beginning, where risk can be so great from the very beginning, from the start. When you're even bringing in your first vendor, you can already apply risk management principles because they're going to be your justification for how you're conducting your relationship with them, how frequently you choose to audit them, the type of audit you're even going to do for them based on the service they provide, the categorization that Rosanna recommended. That can start from the very beginning. Sometimes I know we think about deviation management and change control, but sometimes for our early stage companies that outsource, that's not the priority at first because that's happening sometimes at the vendor. Really, the first place you can apply risk management is right there from the first one. You don't have to have a slew of vendors to supply that. You can start it from the very beginning. So I just want to send a recommendation out for that. Other than that, I think there was just so many great takeaways there for the listeners from the interview.
Yeah, so as always, lots to think about and reflect on there. So, as usual, we'll be back next month with another topic and another guest. And finally, excitedly, we will be providing our recommended book list to wet your whistles for our July episode. Please do subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts, so new episodes will miraculously make their way into your feed. And as I said, do join us on the LinkedIn Risk Revolution podcast page. And feel free to give us your thoughts and ideas and join us on our quest to read some interesting, thought-provoking books over the summer. Thank you for listening. And finally, Laurie, before we go, what's in the show notes?
Yeah, so we're going to provide a couple of links to the knowledge management articles that we talked about early on today. They'll come in two because there's a part 1 and a part 2 to those articles. We will also provide, I'd like to actually get the ISPE guidance you were talking about, Nuala. Would that be
Oh, yeah.
possible that we could share
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
EMA has oversight of vendor management, so we'll include a link to that is part of the regulations. There's also an EMA excipient risk assessment guidance document that actually talks about the vendor oversight piece in that risk assessment that must be considered. We will include that link. It's actually quite prescriptive. One of the best guidance documents I think I've gotten, where it literally tells you exactly what you need to include in that risk assessment, and a lot of it is the vendor piece of that. And then lastly, the FDA guidance for industry contract manufacturing agreements for drugs and quality agreements. So we'll include the link for that too. So a lot of regulation stuff. Maybe pick and choose what you want to dig in there or sort for what you want. I know regulations can be a little bit hard to go through, but these are actually really good, and there's some good pieces in there for the contract giver as well.
Brilliant. So it's goodbye from Nuala.
Oh, goodbye from Lori.
And goodbye from Val.